قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me and the ITV Networks. Today a very special guest, but a very important topic as well. With me is Dr. Gerard Hagg, who is a senior researcher, a research specialist at the HSRC, the Human Sciences Research Council, and he has done phenomenal work in terms of the Royal Bafokeng, as well as generally discussions around poverty and inequality in South Africa. And to bring these together, I have decided that after listening to a very interesting presentation by Gerard, let me put it that way, I thought it was important to share this because so often it is that we go through very many issues in South Africa without fully understanding, but then we become experts and we like to comment on them, and especially with regards to traditional leadership. So this was an ideal opportunity, and I'm really grateful to Dr. Gerard for giving me this time. Thank you, Gerard.
You're welcome.
Gerard, you've done a lot of work on poverty and inequality in South Africa. I mean, it's a big issue. If you trace our history, the context from colonialism to apartheid, in many ways, poverty has been created in this country. Mm-hmm. People have been impoverished, intentionally through specific laws, procedures, processes, etc. Have you seen a change in terms of the way in which the state responds to poverty and inequality, or do you find that many of the mechanisms and responses are still the same?
Now, the state has created an extensive number of policies and legislation around poverty and inequality, a very strong emphasis on inequality, all emanating obviously from the Constitution, with its preamble that speaks about the equality, dignity, and a fair share of the wealth in the country. Policy development has been uneven under different presidents, with President Mandela a very strong emphasis on, let's say, a social democratic approach based on the Freedom Charter and the RDP, but at that stage lacking the capacity in the state to implement most of those policies. But it laid the foundation for an anti-poverty and a more equal society. That era was followed obviously by the Thabo Mbeki era, which was far more economistic, which had a very strong emphasis on, let's say, almost like, as some critics say, a more neoliberal approach towards economics, which brought much more wealth into the country, but not necessarily shared by all the people. The Zuma period was very uneven, even more policies emanating from administration and legislative environment, which emphasized the need for equality and employment and poverty alleviation, but which had often, let's say, personal interests which were more important than, let's say, the countries. Within that era, obviously, we received the whole grant system, which alleviated the, let's say, the deepest poverty or the most extreme poverty, which reduced the extreme poverty from something like 30% of the population down to around 10%. And that is, I think, an important achievement by the ANC-led government. The main problem is that the poverty and inequality is a structured phenomenon in the South African society. So the whole relationship, for example, within the economy is still very much based on race and ethnicity, and that's a reality you can't wish away. It takes years to bring in a new, let's say, well-educated and trained cadre of middle level to higher level officials, but the same in the industry and in the private sector. And the poles are shifting all the time. At a very early stage, the poverty alleviation policies were aimed at employment creation, and it was seen as achievable by means of better education. And yet at the same time they closed the technical colleges or amalgamated them with some of the universities. And a very important component, access point of industry and the manufacturing sector was through the early apprenticeships, which fell away, and the CETA system didn't replace that, it was too cumbersome. So there's much improvement in terms of the systems that have been developed and the legislation. The big thing is the implementation of it. And it's an old theme with all researchers that we are in South Africa very good at policy making. We have excellent legislation to a large extent, although lately it has become confusing. And then ultimately it must be implemented. Yes. And the capacity for implementation often depends on the capacity of people. And those people were often not trained for that type of implementation.
Yeah, so one of the the key factors that you identify is education in terms of helping to alleviate poverty or for poverty alleviation. If the government recognizes that, then why is it that they have been so resistant in terms of giving access to students' education? I mean, we saw the effect with fees must fall and, the vicious turnaround from the state. So instead of building towards a more educated society, I mean, uplifting, of course, even basic education, which is in a mess, so it's as if they're talking with one voice and they're doing with another.
Let me give you an example what that's typical of the problem that you raised is the net lack situation, where government and labor and industry and, in a way, community are represented and have to find that balance and that cooperation. And in all those years, net lack has not been successful in resolving that, let's say, that relationship on the one hand by the industry and the other hand, for example, labor. Mm-hmm. And government sits sort of in the middle, but with labor being represented, the union being represented in government. And that creates very awkward situations. On the one hand, it creates a situation that government cannot really act against the unions, for example, teachers' absentness in the schools. Yes. And we know from research that has been done that up to 10, perhaps 15% of the teachers are not in schools on daily rate. On the other hand, we have had major shifts in the industries, in the private sector, which meant that those students who finished and got their degree, when they apply for work, one of the very first questions is not what do you know, but what can you do? In fact, what can you contribute, what value can you contribute to what we are doing in this industry, for example? And that depends on the experience. Now, the CETA system was supposed to link workshop experience with the theoretical education. And in many instances that never happened. And which is not so strange. The corporate sector has a continuous pressure on it to perform or to outperform others. And that's within a global system against Chinese imports, Indian imports, lack of access to markets, but that type of experience that they are expecting from new entries, if that doesn't exist, they often look at alternatives, and one of the alternatives increasingly is automation. And for the past 2-3 years, HC has become more involved in research on the fourth industrial revolution. I don't think we fully understand the implications of that. But the reality is that this new generation is going to experience that in the next decade. So
do you think the new generation then will become redundant in a way if the education system doesn't improve?
I think what will happen is that you get a number of students who finalize their studies, who have the knowledge and the self-assertiveness and their self-confidence to enter the market. At the same time, we will have a very huge number of students who, let's say, finish grade 11 or 10, are school leavers, and have no access to any of the jobs, because the lower skilled jobs in South Africa are becoming less. Partly because the decrease in the factory sector, in the mining sector.
Industrial sectors also declined considerably.
Yeah, definitely. And so what they're now looking for is people who can help the company to get back into the competitive position. That means that they are looking for people that you can tell, here's a job, here's a problem, we'll talk tomorrow about how you will handle that. And very few students learn that, even at the technical universities. It's a challenge.
So we have to go to a break. When we come back, I just want to raise this a little further with you, that if there is less jobs becoming available for low skilled or unskilled individuals, and that is already a huge section of South Africa's population, doesn't that then contribute or exacerbate the poverty in this country? Okay, so we'll take this further when we come back after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, and welcome to Finding Me in the ITV networks with my very special guest, an incredible researcher, a phenomenal mind, Dr. Gerard Hagg, and we're speaking about poverty and inequality in South Africa. Gerard, before we went into the break, you spoke about this divide, and so, as I said, we have a huge unemployment rate in South Africa. Some say if you add the unofficial numbers, it's as high as 40%. Now, if there's less jobs and there's, like you said, school leavers, every year there's a certain amount of school leavers, certain amount of students who finish matric but don't make it into higher education. As these numbers increase and there are lesser jobs even in the low-paying jobs, unskilled, low-skilled jobs, what happens then to this country? Are we sitting on a ticking time bomb?
Yeah, the concept of the ticking time bomb is old. They warned us in 1996. Because there had been research over more than 20 years at several universities around this problem, the youth. I think the confusions that were created during the transformations in the education sector have not really contributed to elevating the education system as a whole to a level where they link up with what the industry expects. And now we find that the industries are changing their demands for the type of work. So, one could call it a ticking time bomb. Let's put it this way, the risks have not been averted. The reality is that we have not resolved the problem.
And in my opinion, it just seems to be getting worse, because I was speaking to a whole lot of students yesterday, and a lot of them, who are like young students affiliated maybe as EFF or ANC students, etc., and said that the level of protests in this country is going to escalate next year as we head towards the 2021 municipal elections, because people are getting more and more frustrated. And I mean, a large portion of the protesters are youth, are individuals, who are sitting around in the townships, around in the squatter camps, outside, walking around from pillar to post, but there's no job. So what do you do?
Yeah, that's what do you do? It's the golden question, of course, to any government. I think the NDP tried to find a framework for that problem. Because it's a multi-pronged approach that you need. The unions must be able to compromise around their insistence on, let's say, a decent wage, to make the low access entry wage of the students into the economy possible. Now, for a long time there has been resistance against this idea about the lower wage for entrance into the economy, but I think slowly but surely the unions are accepting the idea that there's no choice.
Okay, but I have to stop you then and ask you, when you say a lower wage, do you mean a lower wage in terms of like just market-based, or is it related to the setting the minimum wage?
Yeah, you probably talk more about the minimum wage than about the market wage. I'm not sure whether we can still talk about market wages in this country, because for a number of years the different industrial sectors have negotiated about the minimum wages, so that in the mines the minimum wages are higher than, for example, domestic servants. So there's a disparity between the two. And minimum wage, interestingly, in the new State of the Nation volume that will appear early next year or mid next year, there's a chapter on the minimum wage, and much research is being done. There's a trade-off. The moment your minimum wage lifts, you improve the lives of those who receive it.
Yes.
The moment you do that, you do not impact on the poorest families. Because in the poorest families, there are the fewest members with a job. Let's say a typical informal settlement family consists of 6 people. One may have a job. To increase that one with, let's say, 20% does not impact that much on those other 5 people. While in the normal, let's say in a smaller family with better educated people, if they get their minimum wage, all 4 members of the family who have a job may increase. So it may relieve let's say, the middle class probably better. And the other thing is it will increase the inequality between the lowest sector and the higher sectors. Because the lower sectors benefit least of a minimum wage. Now that acceptance that the minimum wage is negotiable, it has to be negotiated, and concessions have to be made, or other solutions have to be found, like subsidies. A very simple example was what happened in the wine region in the Cape, Western Cape, when they increased minimum levels of the minimum wage. The response generally from the wine farmers was, that's fine, so to compensate us, we will remove, let's say, fringe benefits like transport to the school and to the shops, or free food or something like that. And it didn't really bring the relief that they were thinking of. Because a businessman, and that's typical of businessmen, is look first after themselves and their companies.
So I was going to ask you, ultimately then, is it still not about who has power to control the wage? Because then it's about maximum benefit, maximum profit, and do what you can to screw over the worker. Ultimately, that's what it's all about. So if the state does not intervene and put in certain stringent legislation in order to protect, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what you said. And you said that with minimum wages, the lowest income does not benefit. But I mean, like how? I would think they would benefit.
Yeah, the individual may benefit, but the lowest, let's say, the lowest qualified sector in society has this typical situation where in one household, one person may have a job.
Okay, so he's talking about in terms of comparatively, in terms of who's employed in the family.
It's a major issue in how wage increases impact on a family. And an increase of, let's say, 20 or 30% on one person, while there are 5 people being dependent on that salary, has less impact than 4 members in a family all receiving a 20% increase. That substantially alleviates their lives.
There's one question that has always bothered me. There's always this uproar about minimum wages to say, no, that we cannot afford this, mine workers cannot get this. But if you did it, and I'm sure you have done this, I've come across this comparative studies of mine workers, say, in Australia or in other parts, or farmers in New Zealand, Australia compared to South Africa, doing the same kind of work basically, but their salaries are far more higher, yet their farmers survive, they make profits, and they're competitive in the global market. So why is it that in South Africa, it is that the minute you speak about increasing the wages of workers, there's an issue to say, oh no, that we'll employ less, they're going to go bankrupt, mines will close down, farmers will run out of business, etc.
The reality is that in the past we have had an increase in salaries at the higher level of income. That was usually the white community, and lower rise of the wages at the bottom end. So the gap increased. Increasing the gap at the bottom would require a compromise at the top.
Yes.
And there's often the argument, if the CEO, who earns, let's say, 250 times as much as what the lowest worker earns, if he take half of his salary, he could still make a good living out of 5 million per year. That's fine. We could spread it among the workers. But if you make the calculation, it means all the workers get 100 rand or 200 rand in their hands. That's from the mining sector. But symbolically, we have reached a point, and that's internationally recognized by a number of economists, that this almost obscenely or perverse high bonuses and salaries that are paid at the CEO level and sort of around that level.
I know, I've done quite a bit of research recently, and I found that South Africa has one of the biggest remuneration gaps between those at the top and those at the bottom.
And that has to do with markets. The number of people who can make an ailing company turn around to make it profitable in this country is so small that they can ask what they want. A very simple example is about 5 years ago, Pick and Pay, Ackerman stood back and they handed over. Within 2 years, they started making losses. We're talking about how many employees? 40, 50,000, I don't know, but a lot. He came back when the company was making major losses and couldn't compete with Checkers, for example, and Spar. He turned around the company to make profits again. In fact, they make more profits now than the others. So it's always at the loss of the others that it's happening. The value of that man in terms of the profits, let's say the profits are, let's say 5 billion a year. That man is worth 50 million around a year. If you take him away, that competitiveness disappears from the company. And that's not only in South Africa, it's worldwide. And what has been happening over the past 2 decades, 3 decades, is that international companies have been poaching some of our best CEOs.
Wow.
So they are attracted because they're paid in dollars or euros, but not only that, it's a totally different environment. And in South Africa, the ones who stayed behind obviously set their price. There's an ethical issue in it. And it's one of the reasons why the new State of the Nation that we are now finalizing the manuscript, the subtext is the ethics around poverty alleviation and
that's fantastic. I'm really glad that you're touching on that, because this is very dear to my heart, and I've raised this in very many programs, is to talk about ethics and bringing the ethical back. But Gerard, we're at the end of the first interview. We're coming back for a second one, where I want to then raise the whole question about traditional leadership and the Royal Bafokeng, where you've done research in that, and I'm sure there are very many ethical issues to raise in that discussion as well. But thank you for sharing this as a background and a context. We'll see you next week to talk about another very interesting phenomenon that Gerard is going to elaborate on, and that is on the Royal Bafokeng. Of course, as many of you know it, they are basically sitting on the platinum mines in what is known as Rustenburg. Fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في موت